When everyone laughed at the 8-year-old girl moving into the ridiculous Christmas Hobbit house with the glowing mushroom lights and candy cane shutters, they had no idea she was about to uncover $275 million hidden in a tunnel system beneath their judgmental feet. Before we explore this story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The frost clung to the windows of the Greyhound bus as it rolled into Pine Ridge, Vermont, population 3,200, shrinking every year. Emma pressed her small nose against the cold glass, her breath fogging up her view of the tiny downtown. At 8 years old, she'd already learned that moving meant leaving pieces of yourself behind. This was her 4th town in 3 years. Beside her, Grandmother Diane squeezed her hand gently. The older woman's fingers were thin, worn from years of nursing shifts and raising a granddaughter alone after Emma's mother had passed when Emma was only 3. Diane was 62 now, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes carrying the weight of too many goodbyes and not enough money. But when she looked at Emma, those eyes still softened with a love so fierce it could melt winter itself. The bus ride from Burlington had taken 3 hours, winding through mountains that grew steeper and more remote with each mile. Emma had watched the landscape change through the window, the buildings growing smaller, the spaces between them wider, until civilization seemed to thin out like watercolor paint diluted to transparency. She'd counted the churches they passed, 7, and the cemeteries, 5, and the houses with Christmas lights already up even though it was only mid-November, 12. She liked counting things. It made the uncertain feel manageable, turned chaos into numbers she could understand. The bus hissed to a stop in front of a weathered diner with a blinking neon sign that read, Millie's. Half the letters didn't work. Emma grabbed her backpack, the one with the patches she'd sewn on from every place they'd lived, Burlington, Montpelier, Rutland, and now this one, which she hadn't made yet because she didn't know if Pine Ridge would be home long enough to deserve a patch. Diane carried 2 duffel bags, everything they owned in the world that mattered. They stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, and the November wind bit through Emma's thin jacket. She shivered, pulling it tighter. The cold here felt different than Burlington, sharper somehow, like it had teeth. The town stretched out before them in a single main street of old brick buildings that had seen better decades. A hardware store with faded paint, a post office the size of a garden shed, a library that shared space with the town hall. Everything looked tired, worn down by winters that came early and left late. Diane set down the bags and knelt in front of her granddaughter, adjusting Emma's scarf with careful hands. Her knees creaked as she crouched, a reminder that she wasn't as young as she used to be, that the years of double shifts and worry had carved themselves into her bones. "Remember what I told you?" Diane whispered, her voice gentle but firm. Emma nodded. "Home isn't a place, it's us." Diane smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "That's right, sweet girl. Always us." They'd come to Pine Ridge because Diane had lost her job at the hospital in Burlington. Budget cuts, they said. 23 years of service, and they'd let her go with 2 weeks severance and a handshake that felt like betrayal. The rent was due, the savings account had exactly $147, and winter was coming fast. Diane had spent 3 sleepless nights searching online for anything they could afford. Apartments were too expensive. Rooms for rent required deposits they didn't have. She'd scrolled through listing after listing, each one a door slamming in her face. Too much money, too far from schools, no children allowed, references required, first, last, and security deposit. The words blurred together until they became a chorus of rejection. She'd almost given up when she found the listing, buried on page 6 of a rural property website that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2005. The page loaded slowly, images taking forever to appear. The design something from the early internet when people still thought flaming text was sophisticated. The ad was simple, almost absurdly so. House for sale, Pine Ridge, Vermont. $3,500 or best offer, unique property, serious inquiries only. $3,500. Diane had $4,000 left in her retirement account, Money she'd sworn never to touch. Money that was supposed to be for Emma's future, for college or emergencies or something better than this. But desperate times carved new paths through old promises. She'd called the number. A man answered on the first ring, his voice scratchy and ancient, like he'd been waiting by the phone for years. "You calling about the house?" he asked. "Yes," Diane said carefully. "The listing says 3,500. Is that real?" The old man chuckled, a sound like dried leaves scraping pavement. "Real as rain, but I gotta warn you, most folks take one look and run the other way." "Why?" "Because it's different. Real different. The previous owner, he was what you might call eccentric. Built the place himself back in 1976. Took him 11 years. Folks around here think it's cursed or haunted or just plain crazy." Diane had paused, her heart sinking. "What's wrong with it? Structurally, I mean. Does it have plumbing? Heat?" "Works just fine," the man said. "Roof don't leak. Furnace runs. Water's clean. Got it inspected myself last year when Theodore passed. Everything's up to code, believe it or not. It's just the way it looks that spooks people." "How does it look?" The old man had gone quiet for a moment. "Ma'am, you really got to see it to understand. But if you need a place and you got $3,500, I'll sell it to you sight unseen. I'm the executor of the estate. Owner died with no family. Been sitting empty for 4 years now. I just want it gone." Diane had taken the deal over the phone. She wired the money the next day, watching her retirement account drain to $450, a number that felt like drowning. The deed arrived 3 days later in a manila envelope with a single key taped inside and a hand-drawn map to the property. Now, standing on the cold street in Pine Ridge, Diane pulled out that map. A local taxi driver, a gruff man named Carl with a beard that reached his chest, loaded their bags into his trunk. His taxi was an old Crown Victoria that had probably been decommissioned from police service, still painted a faded white with ghost marks where official decals had been removed. "Where to?" he asked. Diane showed him the address. Carl's eyebrows shot up. "You're going to the Hobbit house?" Emma perked up. "Hobbit house? Like from the movies?" Carl snorted. "Not quite, kid. That's just what folks call it. The Christmas Hobbit house, actually. You'll see why." He said nothing else during the 15-minute drive out of town. They wound through pine forests dusted with early snow, past frozen ponds and farmhouses with smoke curling from chimneys. Emma watched it all, trying to memorize landmarks, trying to understand this new place that was supposed to be home. The road narrowed to gravel, then to dirt. Finally, Carl slowed and pointed through the windshield. "There she is," he said. Emma gasped. Nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering evergreens sat the most peculiar house she'd ever seen. It wasn't tall, maybe 1 story, but it spread wide and low, built into the hillside, like something from a fairy tale gone slightly mad. The walls were round, made of smooth river stones mortared together in swirling patterns. The roof was curved and covered in dark green shingles that looked like dragon scales. But that wasn't what made it strange. The entire house was decorated permanently, elaborately for Christmas. Not tasteful holiday decorations. This was Christmas on steroids, Christmas that had lost its mind and never looked back. Giant fake mushrooms, at least 4 feet tall, dotted the front yard, each one painted in bright red with white spots and fitted with glowing lights inside. The windows had shutters shaped like candy canes, painted in spiraling red and white stripes. The front door was round, bright green, and had a massive wreath made of what looked like metal pine cones welded together. Icicle lights hung from every edge of the roof, thousands of them, dormant now but clearly permanent fixtures. Along the stone walls, someone had mounted life-sized carved wooden figures, reindeer mid-leap, elves with pointed hats and exaggerated grins, snowmen with top hats and scarves. In the center of the yard stood a 15-foot Christmas tree made entirely of metal, its branches spread wide, waiting for winter to decorate it with real snow. And strangest of all, perched on the roof's peak, was a sleigh. A full-sized sleigh, painted candy apple red with golden runners, as if Santa himself had crash-landed and never bothered to leave. Emma stared, mouth open. Diane's face had gone pale. Carl cleared his throat. Like I said, the Christmas Hobbit house. Theodore, the guy who built it. He was obsessed with Christmas and fantasy stuff. Spent his whole life working on this place. Neighbors thought he was nuts. Does all that light up? Emma asked, pointing to the icicle lights. Carl nodded. Every single bulb. Old Theodore had it on a timer. The whole thing would light up every night from December 1st through January 6th. You could see it from town on a clear night. Looked like a UFO made of Christmas cheer. Diane finally found her voice. We own this now? Yep, Carl said. Lock, stock and candy cane shutters. Good luck. He helped them unload the bags, refused a tip Diane couldn't afford anyway, and drove off, leaving them standing in the dirt driveway, staring at their new home. Emma looked up at her grandmother. Grandma Diane, it's beautiful. Diane wanted to cry. She'd spent their last bit of security on a house that looked like a deranged Christmas elf had vomited all over it. How would they ever fit in here? How would Emma make friends when the other kids found out she lived in the town's laughingstock? What had she done? What terrible mistake had she made in her desperation? But when she looked down at Emma's face, glowing with genuine wonder, something in her chest eased. The child saw magic where adults saw madness. Maybe that was the difference between surviving and living. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. Let's go inside, Diane said softly. The green round door opened smoothly with the old key. Inside, the house was nothing like the outside. The main room was circular, with walls of the same smooth river stone. The ceiling curved overhead, supported by thick wooden beams carved with intricate patterns of leaves and stars. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel carved to look like a forest scene with deer and rabbits frozen in stone. The floor was wide plank oak, worn smooth by time but solid. There was furniture, too, a couch covered in faded burgundy fabric, 2 armchairs that had seen better decades, a wooden table with 4 mismatched chairs. Bookshelves lined an entire wall, empty now except for dust. It's warm, Emma said, surprised. Diane touched the radiator along the wall. Heat poured from it. The executor must have turned the heat on before we arrived. They explored slowly, reverently, as if walking through a museum dedicated to one man's peculiar vision. There were 3 bedrooms, each one round with curved walls. The largest had a bed frame carved from dark wood, the headboard shaped like a rising sun. The smallest, clearly meant for a child, had built-in shelves and a window seat overlooking the forest. This one's mine, Emma declared, dropping her backpack on the floor. The bathroom was surprisingly modern, updated sometime in the 90s with simple white fixtures. The kitchen was tiny but functional, with old appliances that hummed to life when Diane tested them. The refrigerator kicked on with a shudder. The stove burners glowed red when she turned the knobs. Even the ancient dishwasher rumbled when she pressed the button. Everything worked. Everything was clean, as if someone had been maintaining it even after Theodore's death. Diane found a note on the kitchen counter, written in shaky handwriting. Furnace serviced October 2023. Pipes winterized. Propane tank full. Good luck. Sorry about the decorations. Theodore wouldn't let anyone take them down. Said they were part of the house's soul. Emma wandered back into the main room, her small fingers trailing along the stone walls. The surface was cool and smooth. Each stone fitted so precisely she could barely feel the mortar between them. Grandma, why would people laugh at this house? It's magical. Diane came up behind her, wrapping her arms around Emma's shoulders. Sometimes people laugh at things they don't understand, sweetheart. Things that are different scare them. That's silly, Emma said. Different is what makes things special. The next morning, Diane enrolled Emma in Pine Ridge Elementary School. The building was old brick, 2 stories, with a flagpole out front and playground equipment that looked like it had been installed during the Reagan administration. The secretary, a pinched-faced woman named Carol, processed the paperwork with barely concealed judgment. Name? Carol asked, not looking up. Emma, Diane replied. Emma Walsh. Address? Carol asked. 15 Evergreen Hollow Road, Diane replied. Carol's typing stopped. She looked up, her eyes narrowing behind thick glasses. That's the Hobbit house. That's our home, Diane corrected gently. Carol's lips pressed into a thin line. She typed a few more keys, then printed out a form and slid it across the counter. She'll start Monday. Bus picks up at 7:45 at the end of Evergreen Hollow. School starts at 8:30. Lunch is $3.50, or she can bring her own. Thank you, Diane said. Carol said nothing, just returned to her computer screen, the conversation clearly over. Emma started school the following Monday. She wore her best dress, the blue one with small flowers that Diane had washed and ironed the night before. She carried a lunchbox Diane had packed with a sandwich, an apple, and a cookie they couldn't really afford. Diane walked her to the bus stop at the end of their dirt road. 3 other children waited there, 2 boys and a girl, all around Emma's age. They stared as Emma approached, their conversation dying mid-sentence. You live in the weird Christmas house? One of the boys asked. His name tag read Tyler. Emma nodded. It's not weird. It's wonderful. The girl, Amanda, giggled. My mum says only crazy people live there. Are you crazy? Emma's cheeks flushed, but she kept her chin up. No, we're just people who needed a home. The bus arrived, saving her from further interrogation, but on the ride to school, she heard the whispers, saw the pointed fingers, felt the isolation that comes from being different in a small town where different equals dangerous. At school, it got worse. During lunch, no one would sit with her. Emma carried her tray to table after table, and each time kids would suddenly remember they needed to sit somewhere else. She finally sat alone at the end of a long table, eating her sandwich while trying to look like she didn't care. During recess, the other kids played in groups that closed ranks when she approached. When she asked if she could join a game of jump rope, the girls looked at each other and said they were done playing. She spent the afternoon sitting under a tree, reading a book from the classroom shelf, pretending she didn't notice the clusters of kids whispering and looking her way. When Diane picked her up that afternoon, Emma's eyes were red but dry. How was it? Diane asked carefully. Fine, Emma lied. I made lots of friends. Diane knew better, but she didn't push. She just held Emma's hand a little tighter on the walk home. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The house made sounds she wasn't used to yet. Creaks and groans, the wind whistling through the eaves, the furnace clicking on and off. She got up, wrapped herself in a blanket, and padded into the main room. Moonlight streamed through the windows, painting everything silver. The carved fireplace mantel seemed to move in the shadows, the stone deer leaping, the rabbits frozen mid-hop. Emma walked to the bookshelf and ran her fingers along the empty shelves. Dust came away on her fingertips. She noticed something odd. One shelf, about waist-high, had grooves worn into the wood, as if something heavy had been pulled across it many times. Curious, she tugged on the shelf. It moved. Not much, just a slight shift, but it moved when the others didn't. Emma pulled harder. The shelf swung outward with a soft click, revealing not a wall behind it, but a dark opening. A doorway. Emma's heart hammered in her chest. She should get Grandma Diane. She should close the shelf and go back to bed. She should do anything except what she was about to do. But Emma had learned young that the world was full of closed doors and locked opportunities. When you found something open, even just a crack, you had to look. She grabbed the flashlight Diane kept by the front door and shone it into the opening. Stone steps led down into darkness. The air that wafted up was cool and dry, smelling faintly of earth and something else. Something metallic and old. Emma took one step down, then another. The stone walls on either side were smooth, carved by hand, just like the house above. Someone had spent an enormous amount of time building whatever this was. After 12 steps, the staircase ended in a tunnel. It was tall enough for an adult to stand in, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The walls continued the same smooth stone construction, and every 10 feet or so, there were alcoves carved into the walls. In the first alcove, Emma found an old oil lantern, the glass chimney dusty but intact. She didn't dare light it, but she kept walking, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The tunnel stretched on, deeper into the hillside. Emma counted her steps. 50, 75, 100. The temperature stayed constant, cool but not cold, as if the earth itself was breathing around her. Then the tunnel opened into a chamber. Emma stopped at the threshold, her flashlight sweeping across the space. It was a room, maybe 20 feet across, carved entirely from the bedrock. The ceiling arched overhead like a cathedral. And along the walls, built into stone niches, were wooden crates, dozens of them. Some were small, like shoeboxes. Others were the size of steamer trunks. All of them were sealed, their lids fastened with brass latches that had turned green with age. Emma approached the nearest small crate. The wood was dark with time, but solid. She touched the latch. It opened easily, as if it had been oiled recently. Inside, wrapped in cloth that crumbled at her touch, was a book. Not just any book. Emma lifted it carefully, her small hands trembling. The cover was leather, tooled with gold designs that caught her flashlight beam and threw it back in dancing patterns. She opened it gently, afraid the pages would disintegrate. The pages were illuminated, hand-painted with images of knights and dragons, castles and maidens. The text was in a language she didn't recognize, all flowing script and decorated capitals. Each letter was a work of art, surrounded by vines and flowers and tiny creatures painted with brushes that must have had only a single hair. At the bottom of the crate was a small card, yellowed with age, written in careful handwriting. Illuminated manuscript, French, circa 1400. Purchased Paris, 1971. Emma's breath caught. 1400. That meant this book was over 600 years old. Older than America. Older than the discovery of America. This book had existed when people still thought the earth was flat. She closed the book carefully, placed it back in the crate, and opened another box. Inside was a small painting, maybe 8 inches by 10 inches, in an ornate gold frame. It showed a woman in Renaissance clothing, her expression serene, her eyes following Emma with uncanny intensity. The brushwork was so fine, Emma could see individual hairs painted on the woman's head, could see the texture of her dress, could almost see her breathing. The card read, Portrait Study, Italian School, possibly Raphael Workshop, 1500 to 1520, acquired Rome, 1974. Emma's hands shook as she closed that crate and moved to a larger one. Inside, cushioned in ancient straw, was a sculpture. Bronze, maybe 2 feet tall, showing a Greek warrior with a spear, every muscle defined, every detail perfect. The metal had a green patina that made it look ancient and beautiful. Greek bronze, 4th century BC, Athens Black Market, 1968. Emma stumbled backward, her mind reeling. She swept her flashlight around the chamber, really looking now. There were at least 50 crates in this room alone. And at the far end of the chamber, the tunnel continued. She followed it, her fear forgotten, replaced by a sense of wonder so profound it felt like flying. The second chamber was larger. The crates here were massive, some 6 feet long. Emma opened one, struggling with the heavy lid. Inside, packed in layers of protective cloth, was a painting. A real painting, enormous, showing a banquet scene with dozens of figures in elaborate period dress. The colors were so vivid they seemed to glow in her flashlight beam. She found the card. Flemish Master, Feast of the Gods, 1630 to 1640, possibly Rubens School, Brussels private sale, 1976. Emma's legs gave out. She sat hard on the stone floor, flashlight falling from her numb fingers. It rolled, casting crazy shadows on the walls, illuminating box after box after box. Theodore, the man who built the Christmas Hobbit house, hadn't been just eccentric. He'd been a collector, an obsessive, secretive, brilliant collector who'd spent his entire life acquiring art and antiquities from around the world and hiding them beneath a house no one would ever take seriously. Emma didn't know what most of it was worth. She was 8 years old, but she knew with a certainty that went bone deep that she was sitting in a treasure vault beyond imagining. And no one knew it was here, no one but her. She picked up her flashlight with shaking hands and stood. The tunnel continued even deeper into the hillside. How far did this go? How many chambers were there? Emma looked back the way she'd come. She could see the faint glow from the staircase, impossibly far away now. She should go back. She should wake Diane. She should tell someone. But something held her there in the darkness, surrounded by centuries of human creation, all hidden beneath a house everyone mocked. She thought about the kids at school who'd laughed at where she lived, about the secretary who'd judged them, about every person who'd looked at the glowing mushrooms and candy cane shutters and decided the people inside couldn't possibly matter. They were all wrong. Theodore had known something they didn't. He'd hidden his treasures in plain sight, protected by ridicule, shielded by the assumption that anything that looked foolish couldn't contain anything valuable. Emma smiled in the darkness. It was the smile of someone who'd just learned the world's best secret. She turned and made her way back through the tunnel, through the first chamber, up the stone stairs. She emerged into the main room, pushed the bookshelf closed until it clicked, and stood there breathing hard, her heart racing. Tomorrow, she'd tell Diane. Tomorrow, they'd figure out what to do. But tonight, Emma walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the forest bathed in moonlight. The trees stood like silent guardians, their branches heavy with the promise of snow. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, its voice lonely and wild. For the first time since her mother died, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever. She felt like she was home. Emma woke the next morning with the secret burning inside her chest like a coal she couldn't spit out. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying the tunnel, the chambers, the crates filled with treasures that belonged in museums. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, turning the frost on the glass into diamonds. For a moment, she wondered if she'd dreamed it all. Then she looked at her hands. Dust still clung to her fingertips, grey and ancient. It was real. Diane was already in the kitchen, making oatmeal on the old stove. She looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper than they'd been a week ago. Money worries, Emma knew. Even though they owned the house now, there were still bills. Heat, food. The propane tank wouldn't refill itself. "Morning, sweet girl," Diane said, forcing brightness into her voice. "Sleep okay?" Emma slid into a chair at the wooden table. "Grandma Diane, I need to show you something." Something in Emma's tone made Diane turn from the stove. "What is it?" "Something in the house. Something I found last night." Diane's expression shifted to concern. "Emma, you didn't go outside alone, did you? It's not safe in the dark." "No," Emma said quickly. "Inside, behind the bookshelf." Diane frowned. "Behind the bookshelf?" Emma stood, took her grandmother's hand, and led her to the main room. She walked straight to the shelf she'd discovered, the one with the worn grooves, and pulled. The hidden door swung open with that same soft click. Diane gasped. "What in the world?" "There's a tunnel," Emma said. "And chambers, and boxes. Lots and lots of boxes." Diane grabbed the flashlight, her nurse's instincts kicking in, always prepared for emergencies. She descended the stairs slowly, one hand on the stone wall for balance. Emma followed, her heart pounding with excitement and nervousness. When they reached the first chamber, Diane stopped so abruptly, Emma almost ran into her. "Sweet Jesus," Diane whispered. They spent the next 3 hours exploring together. Diane opened crate after crate, her hands trembling as she lifted paintings, sculptures, books, and objects Emma couldn't even name. Each discovery made her face paler. In the third chamber, they found pottery. Greek urns painted with scenes of battles and feasts, their surfaces miraculously intact after thousands of years. Roman glass that caught the flashlight beam and scattered it into rainbows. Egyptian scarabs carved from lapis lazuli. In the fourth chamber, jewelry. Not costume jewelry, but the real thing. Necklaces of gold and precious stones, rings that had adorned the fingers of nobility, bracelets that clinked with a sound like wealth itself. The fifth chamber held more paintings, these even larger than the ones before. Diane found one card that made her sit down hard on a wooden crate. Dutch master, still life with flowers, 1650 to 1660, possibly Jan Davids de Heem. Amsterdam auction, 1979. Is that good? Emma asked. Diane laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. Good? Emma, if this is real, if even half of this is real, we're standing in the middle of a fortune. How much of a fortune? Diane looked around at the chamber, at the dozens of crates still unopened, at the tunnel that continued even deeper into the hillside. Millions, maybe tens of millions. Emma's eyes went wide. Can we sell some, so you don't have to worry about money? Diane pulled Emma into a fierce hug. Oh, sweetheart, it's not that simple. We need to figure out if we even legally own all this, and we need to understand who Theodore was and why he hid it. They returned to the house, and Diane immediately began researching. She pulled out the deed, the paperwork from the estate executor, anything that might give them answers. Emma sat beside her at the table, watching her grandmother's face cycle through confusion, shock, and worry. The deed says the house and all contents transfer to the buyer, Diane read aloud. All contents. That would include whatever's underground, wouldn't it? I think so, Emma said, though she was 8 and had no idea how property law worked. Diane pulled out her phone and searched for Theodore's name. Theodore Hart, Pine Ridge, Vermont. The results were sparse. A brief obituary from 4 years ago. Theodore Hart, 78, passed away peacefully at home. No surviving family. Memorial service private. That was it. No mention of his life, his work, his obsessions. Diane dug deeper. She found a few mentions in old local newspaper archives. Theodore Hart had moved to Pine Ridge in 1967, bought the land, and spent the next 11 years building his strange house. He'd worked as an antique dealer, traveling frequently. Neighbors described him as polite but intensely private. He never married, never had visitors, and spent his final years as a recluse. An antique dealer, Diane murmured. That explains how he acquired everything. But why hide it? Emma thought about the kids at school, the way they'd mocked her for living in the Christmas Hobbit house. Maybe he knew people would make fun of him. Maybe he hid it where no one would think to look. Diane stared at her granddaughter. You might be right. Over the next week, they explored more of the tunnel system. It stretched far deeper than they'd initially realized, branching off into smaller passages, some ending in chambers, others sealed with locked doors they couldn't open. They catalogued what they could, taking pictures with Diane's phone, making lists of what each crate contained based on Theodore's meticulous cards. The numbers grew staggering. By Emma's count, there were at least 200 individual pieces of art and antiquities. Diane tried to estimate values based on internet research, but it was impossible. Some pieces had no comparable sales. Others were so rare she couldn't find any information at all. But one thing became clear. They were sitting on a collection worth well over $100 million, possibly much more. The weight of that knowledge pressed on Diane like a physical thing. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every sound outside made her jump, convinced someone was coming to take it all away. Emma noticed her grandmother's fear and tried to help. She made tea. She drew pictures to make Diane smile. She promised to keep the secret. But secrets have a way of leaking out, especially in small towns. It started innocuously enough. Emma came home from school one afternoon to find a man standing in their driveway, taking pictures of the house with a professional camera. "Can I help you?" Diane called from the doorway. The man turned, startled. He was maybe 40, wearing khakis and a fleece vest, the uniform of academic professionals everywhere. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. I'm a professor of architecture at the University of Vermont. I've been documenting unusual vernacular structures in the state. This house is quite remarkable." "Thank you," Diane said carefully, "but we'd prefer privacy." Of course," the man said, lowering his camera. "I just wondered if I might come inside, just for a few minutes. I'd love to see how the interior was constructed." "No," Diane said firmly. "I'm sorry, but no." The professor looked disappointed but nodded. "I understand. Beautiful place, though. Theodore Hart was quite the visionary." "You knew him?" Diane asked, surprised. "Not personally, but I've studied his work. He was obsessed with creating a home that embodied joy and wonder, sad that people mocked him for it. The professor climbed into his Subaru and drove away. That night, Diane locked all the doors and closed all the curtains. "Why are you scared?" Emma asked. "Because people are going to get curious," Diane said. "And curious people ask questions, and questions lead to answers we're not ready to give." She was right. 2 days later, a woman from the Historical Society knocked on the door. She wanted to know if they'd consider letting the house be included in a historic homes tour the following spring. Diane politely declined. 3 days after that, a real estate agent left a business card tucked in the door. "Interested in selling? I have clients who collect unusual properties." Diane threw the card away, but the attention kept growing. A blogger who wrote about strange American roadside attractions posted about the Christmas Hobbit house, including their address. Suddenly, cars were driving by slowly, people taking selfies in front of the glowing mushrooms. Someone even knocked on the door at 9 o'clock at night, asking if they gave tours. Diane called the estate executor, the old man who'd sold them the house. His name was Gerald, and his voice sounded even more tired than before. "I warned you it was different," Gerald said. "It's not the house I'm worried about," Diane replied. "It's what's underneath it." Silence on the other end of the line. "You knew," Diane said. "You knew about the collection." Gerald sighed, a sound like wind through dead trees. "I suspected. Theodore was careful, but over the years I'd see him bring in crates, always late at night, always alone. I asked him once what he was collecting. He just smiled and said, 'The things people throw away because they don't understand their value.'" "Why didn't you mention it when I bought the place?" "Because I never found it," Gerald admitted. "I searched that house top to bottom after he died, never found a single painting or sculpture. I figured maybe I'd been wrong, maybe he'd sold it all. The house passed through probate clean, no valuable assets listed, so legally, whatever you found, it's yours." "Are you sure?" "I'm the estate lawyer," Gerald said. "I'm sure, but Diane, if what you found is as valuable as I think it might be, you need to be careful. There are people who would do bad things for that kind of money." Diane hung up, her hands shaking. That night she sat Emma down at the kitchen table. "We need to decide what to do." "What are our choices?" Emma asked. Diane counted on her fingers. 1, we keep it secret and do nothing. 2, we sell it quietly, piece by piece. 3, we go public and deal with whatever comes. "What do you think we should do?" Diane rubbed her tired eyes. "I don't know, sweetheart, I really don't know." The decision was made for them 2 days later. Emma was at school when it happened. Diane was in the tunnel, photographing a particular sculpture she'd been researching, when she heard a sound from above. Footsteps in the house. She froze, her heart hammering. She'd locked all the doors, she was sure of it. The footsteps moved across the main room, deliberate and searching. Then voices, low and male. "You sure this is the place?" one voice asked. "Positive," another replied. "My buddy works for the Historical Society. Said the old lady who lives here has been asking questions about Theodore Hart. Lots of questions. Questions about art authentication and estate law." Diane's blood ran cold. She turned off her flashlight and pressed herself against the stone wall of the chamber, barely breathing. "So what are we looking for?" the first voice asked. "Anything valuable. Hart was an art dealer back in the day. Rumor is he had a collection worth millions. His estate said there was nothing, but maybe they missed something." "Breaking and entering for maybe? That's stupid, Derek." "It's not breaking if the door's unlocked," Derek replied. "Besides, nobody's home. We look around, take anything small and valuable, and we're gone in 10 minutes. Diane heard them moving through the house, opening closets, checking cabinets. Her phone was in her pocket. She could call 911, but if she spoke, they'd hear her. And if they found the tunnel entrance, if they found her down here surrounded by hundreds of millions in art. She stayed perfectly still, counting her heartbeats, praying they wouldn't find the hidden bookshelf. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, she heard one of them say, "There's nothing here. Place is clean." "Told you," the other replied. "Let's go before someone sees the truck." The front door opened and closed. Diane waited another 5 minutes before she dared to move. She climbed the stairs on shaking legs, peeked into the main room, and confirmed they were gone. Then she called the police. Sheriff Marcus Williams arrived 20 minutes later, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He took Diane's statement, examined the front door lock that had been picked, and made notes in a worn notebook. "You get a look at them?" he asked. "No," Diane admitted. "I was in the back of the house. I just heard voices." "They take anything?" "No. I don't think they found what they were looking for." Sheriff Williams studied her face. "And what would that be exactly?" Diane hesitated. This was the moment. She could lie, could keep the secret buried. Or she could trust someone. She thought about the fear she'd been carrying, the sleepless nights, the constant worry that someone would hurt Emma to get to the collection. "Sheriff Williams, I need to show you something, but I need your word that you'll help us protect it." He raised an eyebrow. "That depends on what it is." "It's legal," Diane said quickly. "We own it, but it's valuable, very valuable, and I'm scared someone's going to get hurt." The sheriff closed his notebook. "Show me." Diane led him to the bookshelf and opened the hidden door. His eyes went wide. "I'll be damned," he muttered. They descended together. With each chamber they entered, each crate they opened, Sheriff Williams's expression grew more serious. Finally, in the fifth chamber, standing in front of a painting of a Madonna and Child that glowed with 500-year-old beauty, he turned to Diane. "Do you have any idea what you have here?" "Some idea," Diane said. "Enough to be terrified." "You should be," the sheriff said bluntly. "This is the kind of thing that attracts the worst kind of attention. Art thieves, con artists, people who would kill for a single piece of this collection." "What do we do?" Sheriff Williams pulled out his phone. "First, I'm calling the state police. They need to know about this. Then we're getting you protection. And then, whether you like it or not, we're going public. Because the only way to keep you safe is to make sure the whole world knows this collection exists and exactly where it belongs. What happens next will turn this quiet discovery into a national sensation, reveal a truth about Theodore that nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the most valuable treasures are hidden in the most unlikely places. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The next 48 hours were chaos. The state police arrived with an art crimes specialist, a sharp-eyed woman named Detective Patricia Monroe, who'd worked cases involving stolen masterpieces for 15 years. She brought a team of experts who descended into the tunnel with cameras, laptops, and an air of barely contained excitement. They catalogued everything, every painting, every sculpture, every piece of pottery and jewelry. They photographed Theodore's cards, cross-referenced them with international databases of stolen art, and verified authenticity with portable equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Emma came home from school to find police cars in the driveway and strangers in her house. She grabbed Diane's hand, terrified. "It's okay," Diane whispered. "They're here to help." Detective Monroe knelt down to Emma's eye level. "You must be Emma. I hear you're the one who found the tunnel." Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. "That was very brave," the detective said gently. "You've helped us uncover one of the most significant private art collections ever found in the United States." "Are you going to take it away?" Emma asked, her voice small. Detective Monroe smiled. "That's not my decision, but I can tell you this. Everything we've verified so far is legitimate. Theodore Hart acquired these pieces legally over the course of 40 years. As far as we can determine, they're yours." By the end of the second day, the preliminary inventory was complete. Detective Monroe gathered Diane and Emma in the kitchen, along with Sheriff Williams and 2 representatives from the Vermont Attorney General's office. "The collection," Detective Monroe began, "contains 247 individual items. Paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, antiquities, and decorative arts spanning from ancient Greece to the 19th century. She paused, letting that sink in. Conservative estimates place the total value at $275 million. The room fell silent. Emma looked at Diane. Is that a lot? Despite everything, Diane laughed. Yes, sweetheart, that's a lot. One of the assistant attorneys general, a young man named Christopher, cleared his throat. Mrs. Walsh, Mr. Hart's estate was settled 4 years ago. All debts were paid, all taxes settled. The property and all contents were legally transferred to you upon purchase. Barring any claims of stolen property, which we've found no evidence of, the collection is yours. What does that mean? Diane asked. It means you have choices, Christopher said. You can sell the collection, donate it, keep it, or some combination, but you should know, the moment this goes public, your lives will change. Dramatically. How public are we talking? Sheriff Williams asked. Detective Monroe sighed. We have to report this to the FBI's art crime team. It's protocol for any discovery of this magnitude. And once we do that, the media will find out. Within 24 hours, this will be national news. Diane felt the room spin. National news? I'm sorry, Detective Monroe said, and she sounded like she meant it. I know this is overwhelming, but you need to prepare yourselves. By this time tomorrow, there will be reporters camped outside your house. She was right. The story broke at 6 the next morning. Vermont girl discovers $275 million art collection hidden under Christmas-themed Hobbit house. Within hours, it was everywhere. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, The New York Times, The Washington Post. International outlets picked it up. BBC, Al Jazeera, media organizations from countries Emma had never heard of. By noon, the dirt road leading to their house was clogged with news vans. Reporters stood in the driveway doing live shots with the glowing mushrooms and candy cane shutters in the background. Helicopters buzzed overhead, getting aerial footage. Sheriff Williams had to call in deputies from 3 neighboring counties to manage the crowd and set up a perimeter. No one could approach the house without permission. Emma watched from her bedroom window, overwhelmed and frightened. This was supposed to be their secret, their discovery. Now it belonged to the world. Diane sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. I'm sorry, sweet girl. I know this isn't what you wanted. Why do they care so much? Emma asked. Because what you found is extraordinary, Diane said. Theodore spent his whole life collecting beauty, and he hid it where no one would think to look. That's a story people can't resist. That afternoon, Detective Monroe brought them a visitor. A woman in her 70s, elegant in a grey suit, with white hair swept back in a neat bun. She introduced herself as Margaret, and she carried a leather portfolio that looked as old as she was. I was Theodore Hart's attorney, Margaret explained. Not for his estate, that was Gerald, but for personal matters. I helped him draw up papers over the years, confidential papers. When I saw the news this morning, I knew I had to come. She opened the portfolio and pulled out a sealed envelope. Theodore gave me this 20 years ago. He said if his collection was ever discovered, I should give this to whoever found it. I think that's you, Emma. Emma took the envelope with trembling hands. Her name was written on the front in shaky handwriting. To the one who looked deeper. She opened it carefully and pulled out a letter, several pages long, written on yellowed paper. Diane read it aloud, her voice catching with emotion. If you're reading this, then someone finally found what I spent my life hiding. I hope you're kind. I hope you're curious. I hope you understand that the world is full of beauty, but most people are too busy to see it. My name is Theodore Hart. I was born in 1945 in a small town in Ohio. My parents were poor, but they taught me to see value in things others discarded. My mother collected buttons. My father repaired broken clocks. They showed me that with patience and care you could make broken things whole again. I became an antique dealer because I loved the stories objects carried. Every painting, every sculpture, every ancient pot held memories of the hands that made it, the eyes that admired it, the lives it touched. When I found beautiful things that others didn't want or didn't understand, I saved them. But I learned quickly that people judge. When you're eccentric, when you're different, when you build a house that looks like Christmas and fairy tales had a baby, people don't take you seriously. They mock you, they dismiss you, they assume you're crazy. So I made my house my armor. I built it to be so ridiculous, so over the top, that no one would ever imagine what was underneath. The glowing mushrooms and candy cane shutters were my protection. People drove by and laughed, and while they were laughing, they weren't looking deeper. I spent 40 years collecting. I traveled the world, buying pieces that museums couldn't afford or didn't want. I rescued art from estate sales and forgotten auctions. I saved beauty from being destroyed or lost, and I hid it all beneath a house everyone thought was a joke. I never married. I never had children. This collection was my legacy, my life's work. But I was afraid that if I showed it to the world, they'd take it away. Afraid that lawyers and governments and greedy people would fight over it until it was scattered to the winds. So I kept it secret, and now it's yours. Please, whoever you are, don't let my fear become yours. These pieces deserve to be seen, to be loved, to be shared. They don't belong in the darkness. They belong in the light. Do what I couldn't. Be brave enough to show the world what beauty looks like when someone actually cares for it. And tell them that the crazy old man in the Christmas Hobbit house wasn't crazy at all. He just understood that the most valuable things are often hidden in the most unlikely places. With hope and gratitude, Theodore Hart. When Diane finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Emma sat very still, holding the letter like it was made of glass. She thought about Theodore, alone in this house for all those years, protecting his treasures, dying without anyone knowing what he'd accomplished. She thought about the kids at school who'd mocked her for living here, about the people who'd driven by and laughed at the decorations, about everyone who'd looked at this house and seen only foolishness. They'd all been wrong. Theodore hadn't been crazy. He'd been brilliant. And now Emma understood what she had to do. She looked up at Detective Monroe, at Margaret the lawyer, at Sheriff Williams and Diane. "We have to share it," Emma said, her voice clear and certain. "Not sell it. Share it." Theodore wanted people to see it. Diane knelt in front of her. "Sweetheart, that's a beautiful thought, but we still need money for food and heat and—" "Then we make it a museum," Emma interrupted. "Right here, in the house. Theodore built it to protect the collection. We can use it to show the collection." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes bright. "A private museum, the Hart collection, open to the public. You'd maintain ownership, but allow scholars and visitors to experience the art." "Could we do that?" Diane asked. "With the right legal structure, absolutely," Margaret said. "You could establish a foundation, charge admission to cover costs, even take a salary as curators. The collection would be protected, accessible, and you'd be honoring Theodore's legacy." Detective Monroe nodded slowly. "It's unprecedented, but it could work. You'd need security, insurance, climate control for the underground chambers. But yes, it could work." Emma looked at her grandmother. "Please, Grandma Diane, it's what Theodore wanted." Diane saw the hope in Emma's eyes, the certainty that they were doing something that mattered. She thought about the letter, about Theodore's fear and his final wish. She thought about how they'd come to this town with nothing but each other and a dream of survival. And she realized that sometimes survival wasn't enough. Sometimes you needed purpose. "Okay," Diane said softly. "Let's build a museum." The room erupted in excitement. Margaret immediately began making calls to arts organizations and museum consultants. Detective Monroe started outlining security requirements. Sheriff Williams volunteered to help coordinate with local authorities. And Emma, 8 years old and suddenly responsible for a $275 million collection, sat back and smiled. She'd found more than treasure in that tunnel. She'd found proof that being different wasn't something to hide. It was something to celebrate. Outside, the news vans kept filming. The helicopters kept circling. The world kept watching. But inside the Christmas Hobbit house, something extraordinary was beginning. A legacy was being reborn, and a little girl who'd been mocked for where she lived was about to show everyone that magic was real. You just had to be brave enough to look for it. The decision to create a museum sounded simple in the warmth of the kitchen, surrounded by people who believed in them. But reality hit hard over the next 72 hours. First came the insurance companies. 3 different firms sent representatives who walked through the tunnel system with calculators and grim expressions. The quotes they returned made Diane's head spin. To properly insure a $275 million collection would cost nearly $400,000 annually. Money they didn't have. Then came the climate control specialists. The underground chambers needed to maintain precise temperature and humidity levels to preserve centuries-old artwork. The estimate for installing proper systems, $1.2 million. Security consultants followed. They recommended motion sensors, cameras, reinforced doors, and a 24-hour monitoring service. Cost, $300,000 for installation, plus $70,000 annually for monitoring. Diane sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by quotes and proposals, her head in her hands. "We can't afford any of this. We have $450 in the bank." Margaret, Theodore's attorney, who'd become their unofficial advisor, tapped her pen thoughtfully. "What if we approached this differently? What if we found partners?" "What kind of partners?" Diane asked. "Museums, universities, arts foundations, organizations that would contribute resources in exchange for access to the collection. The Smithsonian, the Met, regional institutions. They could provide expertise, funding, and legitimacy." Emma, sitting cross-legged on the floor doing homework, looked up. "But then wouldn't they own it?" "Not if we structure it right," Margaret said. "You'd maintain ownership through the foundation. They'd be partners, not owners." Detective Monroe, who'd become a regular presence at the house, nodded. "I've seen it work before. Major discoveries like this often become collaborative efforts. Nobody expects you to do this alone." Over the next week, Margaret reached out to institutions across the country. The response was overwhelming. The director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York called personally. The Smithsonian sent a team of curators. Harvard's art history department wanted to study the collection. Regional museums in Vermont and New England begged for partnership opportunities. Everyone wanted a piece of Theodore Hart's hidden treasure. But with opportunity came problems. It started with a man named Richard Calabrese. He showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, driving a black Mercedes and wearing a suit that cost more than Diane's car. Sheriff Williams stopped him at the perimeter. "I'm here to see Mrs. Walsh," Richard said smoothly. "I have important information about the Hart collection." The sheriff called Diane, who reluctantly agreed to meet him. They sat in the main room, Richard perched uncomfortably on the old burgundy couch, his eyes constantly scanning the space. "Mrs. Walsh, I'll be direct," Richard began. "I represent the Calabrese family. In 1973, my grandfather sold Theodore Hart a Caravaggio painting. A small work, a portrait of a young man, valued at the time at $80,000. Diane's stomach tightened. "Okay." "That painting is now worth approximately $30 million. We believe we have grounds to reclaim it." "On what basis?" Margaret asked sharply. She'd insisted on being present for any legal discussions. Richard pulled papers from his briefcase. The sale contract included a buyback clause. If my grandfather or his heirs ever wished to repurchase the painting, Mr. Hart was obligated to sell it back at the original price plus 10%. My grandfather died in 2005. We only learned about the collection when it became public. We're invoking the buyback clause. Margaret examined the contract, her expression unreadable. This contract expired upon Mr. Hart's death unless specifically transferred to his estate, which it wasn't. "We disagree," Richard said coolly. "We're prepared to litigate." He stood, straightening his suit. "You have 7 days to respond. After that, we file in federal court." After he left, Diane slumped in her chair. "Can they really do this?" "Maybe," Margaret admitted. "The contract is unusual, and there's legal precedent on both sides, but even if they win, they'd only get the one painting." "What if others come forward?" Diane asked. "What if everyone Theodore bought from tries to reclaim their pieces?" Margaret's silence was answer enough. The Calabrese claim opened floodgates. Within a week, 4 more families had come forward with similar demands. An estate in France wanted back a Renaissance sculpture. A dealer in London claimed Theodore had promised to return a medieval manuscript if asked. An Italian family insisted a painting had been loaned, not sold. Each claim came with lawyers, contracts, and thinly veiled threats of litigation. The media loved it. Headlines screamed, "Battle for $275 million, treasure escalates," and vultures circle Vermont art discovery. News crews filmed every person who arrived at the house, speculating wildly about what would happen. Emma watched it all from her bedroom window, her earlier excitement curdling into fear. "Are they going to take everything away from us?" Diane had no answer. The worst came on a Friday night. Diane and Emma were eating dinner when someone pounded on the door. Sheriff Williams was there immediately, his hand on his weapon. Standing outside was a woman in her 50s, mascara running down her face, her voice shrill with emotion. "That collection belongs to my family!" she screamed. "Theodore Hart stole from us!" Sheriff Williams stepped between her and the door. "Ma'am, you need to calm down." "My father was Vincent Moretti," the woman cried. "He was Theodore's business partner in the 1970s. They bought pieces together. When they dissolved the partnership, Theodore kept everything. He cheated my father, and now he's dead and can't defend himself." More reporters appeared, cameras rolling, capturing every word. "Do you have documentation?" Sheriff Williams asked. "I have letters, emails, my father's diary. Theodore Hart was a thief, and this little girl," she pointed at Emma, who stood behind Diane, "is living off stolen property." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Sheriff Williams escorted the woman off the property, but the damage was done. By morning, the story had shifted. Now some outlets were questioning whether Theodore had acquired the collection legally. Old rumors surfaced, whispers about shady deals and black market purchases. The Vermont Attorney General's office called an emergency meeting. Diane and Emma sat in a sterile conference room in Montpelier, surrounded by lawyers and investigators. Christopher, the assistant AG, laid out the situation. "We've received 7 formal claims against the collection, plus another dozen informal inquiries. Each one needs to be investigated. Until we can verify the provenance of every piece, we're recommending you suspend any plans to open a museum." "For how long?" Margaret asked. 6 months, maybe a year. These things take time. Diane felt tears prick her eyes. "We can't wait a year. We don't have the money to maintain this. The property taxes alone are killing us." "Then perhaps you should consider selling," Christopher said gently. "Several auction houses have approached us. Sotheby's, Christie's. They could liquidate the collection and distribute funds according to legal claims." "No," Emma said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. "No," she repeated, louder this time. "Theodore didn't want it sold. He wanted it shared." "Sweetheart," Diane began, but Emma stood up, her small frame radiating determination. "Everyone keeps calling Theodore a thief or crazy or weird, but he's not here to defend himself. We are. And I know what he wanted because he wrote it down. He wanted people to see beauty. He wanted the collection to stay together, and he trusted us to make that happen." She pulled Theodore's letter from her backpack, the one Margaret had delivered. She'd been carrying it everywhere, reading it until she'd memorized every word. He said people judged him because he was different. But being different was how he protected the art. If he'd been normal, if he'd lived in a normal house and collected art normally, none of this would exist. It would have been scattered and sold and broken up decades ago. Emma's voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "And now everyone wants to do exactly what he was afraid of. Break it apart, sell it, make it disappear. We're the only ones who can stop that from happening." The room fell silent. Christopher cleared his throat. "Emma, it's not that simple. Legal claims have to be—" "Then prove them wrong," Emma interrupted. "Theodore kept records of everything. Every purchase, every receipt, every card with every piece. If people say he stole things, make them prove it. Don't make us prove he didn't." Margaret's eyes lit up. "She's right. The burden of proof should be on the claimants. They're the ones making accusations." "We've been operating defensively," another lawyer added, leaning forward. "But we have documentation for every piece in that collection. Theodore was meticulous." Christopher drummed his fingers on the table. It's a good point. We could demand full documentation from every claimant before we even consider their claims valid. Most of them are fishing, Margaret said firmly. They see dollar signs and they're hoping you'll settle rather than fight. But if we make them prove their claims with the same level of detail Theodore used, most will disappear. The meeting shifted after that. Instead of defense, they planned offense. Every claim would be met with a demand for complete documentation, contracts, receipts, correspondence, provenance records. If claimants couldn't provide proof as detailed as Theodore's meticulous cards, their claims would be dismissed. They left Montpellier with something Diane hadn't felt in weeks, hope, but the fight was far from over. Richard Calabrese wasn't bluffing. 2 weeks later, his family filed a federal lawsuit seeking the return of the Caravaggio painting plus damages for lost appreciation value. The case made national headlines. Heirs demand $30 million painting from Vermont girl's collection. What happens next will shake the foundation of everything they've built, reveal the real power of Theodore's careful planning, and remind us why sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truth. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The lawsuit required a response. Margaret assembled a legal team, pro bono lawyers from arts organizations who believed in protecting Theodore's legacy. They filed a motion to dismiss, arguing the buyback clause had expired and the painting was legally purchased. The case went to court on a cold January morning. Diane and Emma sat in the federal courthouse in Burlington, surrounded by reporters and curious onlookers. Richard Calabrese sat across the aisle with his lawyers, confident and smug. The judge, a stern woman named Justice Patricia Chen, reviewed the documents carefully. Then she did something unexpected. "I'd like to hear from the minor," she said, looking at Emma. "Miss Walsh, would you approach the bench?" Diane's heart nearly stopped. But Emma stood and walked forward, her Sunday dress making her look even smaller than she was. "Miss Walsh," Justice Chen said kindly, "this painting they're fighting over. Have you seen it?" "Yes, Your Honor," Emma replied, her voice steady. "Can you describe it?" Emma closed her eyes, picturing it. "It's a portrait of a young man, maybe 16 or 17. He's wearing dark clothes and he's holding a lute. His expression is sad, like he's thinking about something that hurts. The background is almost black, but there's light on his face that makes him look alive." "You remember it in detail," the judge observed. "I remember all of them," Emma said. "Theodore left cards with each piece explaining where he got it and when. The Caravaggio card says he bought it in Rome in 1973 from the Calabrese Gallery for $80,000. Cash. There's a signed receipt." Richard Calabrese's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, the receipt doesn't negate the buyback clause." "I'm not finished," Emma said, and the courtroom went silent at the steel in her voice. Justice Chen raised an eyebrow. "Continue." "The card also has a note on the back. In Theodore's handwriting, it says, 'Seller expressed relief. Painting had been in family for generations but needed money for medical bills. Happy to give it a good home.'" Emma looked directly at Richard Calabrese. "Your grandfather didn't want the painting back. He needed money, and Theodore helped him. And now you want to take it back because it's worth more. That's not fair to Theodore, and it's not fair to your grandfather's memory." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Justice Chen banged her gavel for silence. Richard's lawyer tried to recover. "Your Honor, regardless of sentiment, the contract—" "The contract," Justice Chen interrupted, "is a legal document that must be interpreted in context. Miss Walsh raises an important point. This was clearly a sale motivated by financial need, not a temporary transfer of property. The buyback clause reads as a courtesy option, not an obligation transferable to heirs." She shuffled papers, then delivered her ruling. Motion to dismiss granted. The buyback clause expired with Mr. Hart's death and was not included in the estate transfer. The painting remains the legal property of the Hart Foundation. The gavel came down with finality. Richard Calabrese stormed out. Diane grabbed Emma in a fierce hug. Margaret actually laughed with relief. But more importantly, the ruling set precedent. Within a week, 3 other claims were withdrawn. The Italian family, the French estate, the London dealer, all suddenly decided their cases weren't strong enough to pursue. The woman who'd screamed about her father being cheated, Vincent Moretti's daughter, sent a letter apologizing. Her father's diary, when properly reviewed, actually praised Theodore for being a fair and honest partner. The dissolved partnership had been amicable. She'd been mistaken, driven by grief and greed. By February, all 7 formal claims had been dismissed or withdrawn. The collection was secure, but the legal battles had taken a toll. Diane had used their remaining savings for legal fees. They were down to $93. The property tax bill sat on the kitchen table, marked final notice. Margaret found them sitting in the dark one evening, too discouraged to turn on lights. "I have news," she said gently. "The Smithsonian wants to partner with you, full partnership. They'll provide funding for climate control, security, insurance, everything. In exchange, they get to send scholars to study the collection and include it in their research publications. You maintain full ownership and control." Diane looked up, barely daring to hope. "How much funding?" $2 million to start. More is needed." Emma jumped up. "Really?" "Really," Margaret smiled. "And there's more. The Vermont Arts Council wants to designate this a state cultural heritage site. That comes with annual funding and tax exemptions. And," she pulled out another document, 3 universities want to establish an endowed research position here. The Theodore Hart Chair of Art History. Salary, $90,000 annually. They're offering it to you, Diane." Diane stared at the paper. "Me? I'm a nurse, not an art historian." "You're the curator of the Hart collection," Margaret corrected. "You've catalogued every piece, researched provenances, protected the legacy. You're exactly what they need." For the first time in months, Diane cried tears of joy instead of fear. The transformation happened quickly after that. By March, construction crews were installing climate control systems in the underground chambers. Security experts retrofitted doors and installed cameras. Insurance was secured through a consortium of institutions. And Pine Ridge began to change. The town that had mocked the Christmas Hobbit house suddenly realized they were sitting on a cultural goldmine. The mayor called an emergency town meeting to discuss infrastructure improvements. The road to the house was paved, traffic lights were installed, a parking area was constructed. Local businesses blossomed, Millie's Diner renovated and expanded. A bed and breakfast opened. Gift shops appeared selling Christmas Hobbit house merchandise. A bookstore specializing in art history set up shop in a renovated warehouse. The school where Emma had been mocked now asked if she'd give a presentation about the discovery. She stood in front of her classmates, the same kids who'd laughed at her, and told Theodore's story. Tyler, the boy who'd called her house weird, raised his hand. "I'm sorry I was mean to you. This is actually really cool." Amanda, who'd asked if she was crazy, invited her to a birthday party. Emma made friends. Real friends. Friends who thought having a museum underneath your house was the most amazing thing in the world. But the real change came in April, when the Hart Museum officially opened to the public. They'd limited it to 50 visitors per day by reservation only. The first day sold out in 17 minutes. The waiting list grew to 6 months. Diane led the first tour herself, with Emma at her side. They guided visitors through the tunnel, into chambers that glowed with carefully calibrated lighting, past treasures that took their breath away. A young woman stopped in front of the Caravaggio that Richard Calabrese had tried to claim. She stood there for 20 minutes, tears streaming down her face. "Are you okay?" Emma asked. The woman nodded. "I study art history. I've seen pictures of this painting in textbooks. I never thought I'd see it in person. And here it is in Vermont because one man cared enough to save it. That's magic." An elderly veteran toured the Greek antiquities and told them his grandfather had fought in World War II, protecting art from the Nazis. "This is what he died for," the man said quietly. "Beauty, history, things worth protecting." A group of children from an underfunded school in Burlington visited on a scholarship program Diane had established. They ran through the chambers with wide eyes, touching the stone walls, asking a million questions, seeing beauty maybe for the first time in their lives. This was what Theodore had wanted. This was what Emma had fought for. By summer, the Hart Museum had become one of the most celebrated small museums in America. Articles appeared in art journals. Television programs featured it. Scholars came from around the world to study the collection. But more than that, it became a symbol, a reminder that beauty could hide in unexpected places. That being different wasn't weakness, but strength. That one person's vision, protected by love and determination, could change the world. Emma turned 9 in June. For her birthday, Diane organized a celebration in the main room of the house. Margaret came, Sheriff Williams, Detective Monroe, representatives from partner institutions, and kids from school who were now genuine friends. They sang Happy Birthday surrounded by stone walls and carved beams beneath a ceiling that had witnessed Theodore's loneliness and now rang with laughter. As Emma blew out her candles, she made a wish. Not for money or fame or anything for herself. She wished that Theodore, wherever he was, knew that his collection was safe. That people saw his genius instead of his eccentricity. That his life's work had become exactly what he'd dreamed it could be. A legacy of beauty, a gift to the world. A reminder that sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in the most unlikely places. And all you have to do is be brave enough to look. Outside, the glowing mushrooms and candy cane shutters stood proud in the summer sun. Children posed for pictures in front of them, no longer mocking but celebrating. The sleigh on the roof gleamed red and gold, a beacon of whimsy and wonder. The Christmas Hobbit house wasn't a joke anymore. It was a treasure, just like Theodore had always known it was, just like Emma had believed from the very beginning. The first winter after the museum opened brought something Pine Ridge hadn't seen in decades: hope dressed in Christmas lights. Diane stood in the front yard of the Hobbit house on the first night of December, her hand resting on the main power switch Theodore had installed so many years ago. Emma stood beside her, mittened hand gripping her grandmother's arm with anticipation. Around them, gathered in the cold twilight, stood nearly the entire town. 3,200 people who had come to witness a tradition reborn. "Ready?" Diane asked Emma softly. Emma nodded, her breath puffing white in the freezing air. Theodore would want this. Diane flipped the switch. Instantly, the Christmas Hobbit house exploded into light. Thousands of bulbs illuminated simultaneously, turning the property into something beyond electricity, beyond decoration. It became pure joy made visible. The mushrooms glowed red and white like beacons calling travelers home. Icicle lights cascaded from every roof edge in curtains of gold and silver. The metal Christmas tree in the yard blazed with colors that reflected off the snow, painting the world in rainbow fractals. The candy cane shutters seemed to spin with their spiraling stripes. And the sleigh on the roof, that ridiculous, wonderful sleigh, shone like it had just delivered presents to every believing heart in the world. The crowd gasped, then they applauded, then they cheered. Children squealed and ran toward the lights, their parents following with phones raised to capture magic. Teenagers who normally affected boredom stood transfixed, faces illuminated by wonder they'd forgotten they could feel. Elderly residents wiped tears from their eyes, remembering Christmases when the world seemed less complicated and more kind. Mayor Patricia Henderson, who 12 months earlier had dismissed the house as an eyesore, now stood with her arm around Diane's shoulders. "Theodore would be so proud," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I hope so," Diane replied. But it wasn't just the lights that transformed Pine Ridge that winter. It was everything that came with them. The museum had brought an influx of visitors year-round, but the holidays turned the trickle into a flood. People came from across the country, drawn by articles about the eccentric house hiding a fortune, staying because they found something more valuable than art. They found a community that had learned to celebrate difference instead of mock it. Hotels filled every weekend. Millie's Diner hired 6 new staff members and still had waiting lists for tables. The bookstore that specialized in art history expanded into the building next door. A chocolate shop opened, then a craft brewery, then a gallery showcasing local artists who'd been inspired by Theodore's collection. Employment in Pine Ridge increased by 43% in 8 months. Young people who'd left for opportunities elsewhere started coming back. Families who'd been struggling found stable work. The elementary school, which had been slated for consolidation with a neighboring district, instead gained funding for a new art wing. Emma watched it all unfold with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd known all along that magic was real if you just gave it a chance. But transformation wasn't just economic. It was deeper, more fundamental. It changed how people saw the world. Emma noticed it first in small ways. The grocery store cashier who used to avoid eye contact now asked about her day with genuine interest. The postal worker who delivered mail with businesslike efficiency now took time to admire the museum's latest acquisition announcements. Tyler, the boy who'd mocked her at the bus stop, now volunteered at the museum on weekends, giving tours to school groups with enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including himself. "I used to think art was boring," he admitted to Emma one Saturday afternoon as they reorganized the gift shop. "But that Greek bronze of the warrior, the one from the 4th century BC, I stood in front of it for like 20 minutes thinking about the guy who made it. He's been dead for like 2,400 years, but his art is still here. That's insane. That's like immortality." Emma smiled. That's exactly what Theodore thought. The museum itself evolved beyond anyone's initial vision. The Smithsonian Partnership brought rotating exhibitions, scholars in residence, and international attention. Harvard's art history program established a summer intensive at the museum, bringing graduate students who filled the bed and breakfasts and coffee shops with intellectual energy. The Vermont Arts Council designated it a centerpiece of their Cultural Heritage Initiative. But Diane made sure it never forgot its roots. Admission was always free for Vermont residents. School groups from underfunded districts received scholarship programs covering transportation and lunch. Every Thursday evening, the museum stayed open late with free tours led by local volunteers who'd learned art history through passion rather than degrees. Margaret helped establish the Theodore Hart Fellowship, a fund supporting eccentric artists and collectors who didn't fit traditional molds. The first recipient was a janitor from Burlington, who'd spent 30 years collecting vintage typewriters and documenting their histories. His collection became a traveling exhibition that visited schools across New England, inspiring kids to see beauty in unexpected places. By the museum's first anniversary, they'd hosted over 18,000 visitors from 47 states and 22 countries. The collection's insurance value had been reassessed at $312 million, though Diane refused to think of it in those terms. "It's not about money," she told a reporter from the New York Times. "It's about what Theodore taught us, that the world judges too quickly, dismisses too easily, and misses beauty because it's too busy looking for conventional success." The reporter had nodded, scribbling notes, but Emma wondered if he truly understood. Adults often didn't. They wanted neat narratives and tidy morals. They wanted to reduce Theodore to an eccentric millionaire or a prescient genius. They wanted to make Emma into a lucky girl who stumbled onto treasure. But the truth was messier and more magnificent than any headline could capture. The truth was that Theodore had been lonely and brilliant and afraid. That he'd built armor from Christmas lights and whimsy because the world hurt him for being different. That he'd collected beauty compulsively, obsessively, because beauty was the only thing that never judged him back. The truth was that Emma hadn't just found art. She'd found kinship with a man who died before she was born, a connection across time between two people who understood what it meant to be dismissed and diminished. And the truth was that Diane, who'd spent years just trying to survive, had discovered that sometimes survival wasn't the point. Sometimes you had to risk everything for something bigger than yourself. These truths didn't fit in newspaper articles or museum brochures, but they lived in the stone walls Theodore had carved by hand, in the tunnel he'd dug into the hillside, in every carefully labeled crate that showed how much he'd cared. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. The Museum of Modern Art in New York requested a loan of 3 paintings for a major exhibition on private collectors. The Louvre inquired about a scholarly exchange program. A documentary crew arrived to film a feature about Theodore's life, interviewing everyone who'd known him and excavating stories that painted a picture more complex than anyone had imagined. They discovered he'd been generous, donating anonymously to local charities for decades. They found he'd helped struggling artists by buying their work at fair prices when galleries wouldn't look at them. They learned he'd rescued animals, fixing up strays and finding them homes, never seeking recognition. But they also found evidence of his isolation. Grocery receipts showing he'd eaten the same simple meals for years. Medical records revealing he'd delayed treatment for a serious illness because he didn't want anyone entering his house. Letters he'd written but never sent, reaching out to distant relatives who'd rejected him for being strange. The documentary, when it aired, made viewers cry and reconsider every weird neighbor they'd ever dismissed. It won awards and changed conversations. Suddenly, eccentricity became celebrated instead of mocked. People started protecting quirky landmarks instead of tearing them down. Communities began valuing their strange residents as treasures rather than embarrassments. Emma watched the documentary with Diane in their living room, the same room where Theodore had lived alone for so many years. She wondered if he'd ever sat in this exact spot, surrounded by his secrets, hoping someone would eventually understand. "We understand," she whispered to the empty air. "We finally understand." By Emma's 10th birthday, the Heart Museum had become permanently woven into the fabric of Pine Ridge and beyond. But more importantly, it had changed how Emma saw herself and her place in the world. She was no longer the shy girl who'd been mocked for living in a weird house. She was Emma Walsh, co-curator of one of America's most unique museums, advocate for celebrating difference, and living proof that children could accomplish extraordinary things when adults trusted them. Schools invited her to speak. She talked to auditoriums full of kids about the importance of curiosity, about looking deeper than surfaces, about believing that magic existed if you were brave enough to search for it. "Everyone told me the Christmas Hobbit house was a joke," she'd say, standing on stages that once would have terrified her. But jokes are just things people don't understand yet. Theodore knew that. He built his whole life around that truth. And when I found his collection, I learned the most important lesson of my life. Different isn't wrong. Different is where all the interesting stuff happens. The applause that followed those words felt less like recognition and more like permission. Permission for all the weird kids, the odd kids, the different kids, to believe they mattered exactly as they were. But Emma's favorite moments weren't the big ones. They were the quiet Tuesday afternoons when she'd lead tours for small groups, watching faces transform as they descended into the tunnel and encountered beauty they'd never imagined existed in rural Vermont. She loved the moment when someone stopped in front of a medieval illuminated manuscript, breath-catching as they realized they were looking at something a monk had created by candlelight 700 years ago. She loved watching children press their noses close to paintings, studying brushstrokes, asking questions adults had forgotten to wonder about. She loved the elderly visitors who moved slowly through the chambers, tears streaming down their faces, grateful they'd lived long enough to see something so extraordinary. One Tuesday in June, a woman in her 80s arrived with her grandson, a sullen teenager who clearly didn't want to be there. Emma led them through the collection, and the boy remained unimpressed until they reached a small bronze sculpture of a horse, Greek, 5th century BC. He stopped, really stopped. His whole body went still. "My grandpa had a horse," he said quietly. "Before he died, I used to ride it every summer." The grandmother's hand flew to her mouth. "I didn't know you remembered that. You were so young." "I remember everything about those summers," the boy said, still staring at the bronze. "This looks exactly like Thunder. Same proud head, same strong legs." He reached out, stopping just short of touching it. "Someone made this because they loved a horse. Thousands of years ago, they wanted people to remember how beautiful horses are." Emma's throat tightened. "That's exactly right." The boy turned to his grandmother, tears in his eyes. "Can we come back? I want to draw this. I want to remember it right." They came back every Tuesday for the rest of the summer. The boy filled sketchbooks with drawings of the bronze horse and other pieces that spoke to him. His grandmother told Diane he'd been depressed since his grandfather died, barely speaking, failing classes. "This place brought him back," she said. Theodore brought him back. Stories like that sustained Diane through the exhausting work of running a museum, and there were many such stories. The veteran with PTSD who found peace in the quiet chambers, the autistic child who'd been non-verbal but started speaking about the paintings with eloquent passion, the divorced father who bonded with his daughter over weekly visits to their favorite sculpture. The Heart Museum wasn't just preserving art, it was healing people. By the second anniversary, they'd expanded the educational programs to include art therapy sessions for trauma survivors, creativity workshops for at-risk youth, and memory preservation projects for seniors. The museum became a community center that happened to house priceless art, rather than an art museum that happened to serve a community. And through it all, the Christmas Hobbit house remained exactly as Theodore had built it. The glowing mushrooms, the candy cane shutters, the sleigh on the roof. Diane had been approached multiple times by image consultants suggesting they tone down the decorations to appear more professional. She refused every time. The decorations aren't separate from the museum, she explained to a particularly persistent consultant. They're the whole point. Theodore protected his collection by making his house look ridiculous. The whimsy was his shield. Taking it away would be erasing the most important part of his story. Emma, listening nearby, had added, "Plus, it's awesome. Why would we change awesome?" The consultant left shaking his head, but Diane and Emma just laughed. The house stayed exactly as it was, a beacon of glorious strangeness in a world that too often demanded conformity. 3 years after Emma found the tunnel, Pine Ridge celebrated Theodore Hart Day, an annual festival honoring eccentricity, art, and the magic of looking deeper. The entire town participated. Local artists displayed work in the streets. Musicians performed. Food vendors offered everything from traditional Vermont maple creations to experimental fusion cuisine that Theodore, who'd eaten the same simple meals for decades, probably would have found baffling. But the highlight was the parade of oddities, where residents dressed as their favorite weird historical figures or celebrated their own quirky interests. A retired accountant marched as a giant calculator, celebrating his collection of vintage adding machines. A librarian dressed as a book dragon, honoring her obsession with fantasy literature. Children came as everything from dancing mushrooms to Greek warriors to illuminated manuscript letters. Emma, now 11 and growing confident in ways that still surprised Diane, led the parade dressed simply in overalls and a tool belt, representing the practical magic of curiosity and hard work. The parade ended at the museum, where Diane unveiled a statue. Life-sized bronze, it showed Theodore sitting on a bench, a small smile on his face, one hand extended as if inviting someone to sit beside him. The plaque read, "Theodore Hart, 1945 to 2019. He taught us that different is beautiful, that magic is real, and that the most valuable treasures are the ones we almost overlook. Thank you for believing." The town erupted in applause. Emma stepped forward and placed a single red mushroom, paper-mashed by kids at the elementary school, at the statue's feet. "Thank you, Theodore," she said simply, "for everything." That night, after the crowds dispersed and the vendors packed up, Diane and Emma sat on the bench beside Theodore's statue. The Christmas lights glowed around them, even though it was June, because they'd decided to keep them on year-round, timed to illuminate every evening, as a reminder that wonder didn't have to wait for holidays. "Do you think he knows?" Emma asked, leaning against her grandmother's shoulder. "Wherever he is, do you think he knows what happened?" Diane wrapped her arm around Emma, pulling her close. "I think he knew before we did. I think that's why he left the letter, why he made his house so ridiculous that no one would take it seriously. Why he hid everything so carefully but left just enough clues for the right person to find." "You think he knew I'd find it?" "I think he knew someone with curiosity and courage would find it eventually. And I think he hoped that person would be exactly who they needed to be." They sat in comfortable silence, watching fireflies begin their evening dance. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The forest breathed around them, ancient and alive. Emma thought about the past 3 years. about how terrified she'd been moving to Pine Ridge, how lonely she'd felt at school, how uncertain their future had seemed, about finding the tunnel and realizing that sometimes the best things in life are hidden just behind surfaces everyone else accepts without question. She thought about Theodore, spending decades alone, protecting beauty while the world laughed at him, about how his loneliness had purpose now, how his obsession had meaning, how his strangeness had become his greatest gift. And she thought about Diane, who'd lost everything and risked the little she had left on a house everyone said was worthless, who'd chosen courage over comfort, purpose over safety, legacy over survival. "Grandma Diane," Emma said softly. "Yes, sweet girl? I'm glad the bus broke down in Pine Ridge. I'm glad we were poor. I'm glad we had to buy the weird house nobody wanted." Diane's eyes filled with tears. "Why?" "Because if we'd been rich, we would have bought a normal house. And we would have missed all this. We would have missed Theodore's story. We would have missed learning that magic is real." Diane kissed the top of Emma's head. "You're wiser than most adults I know." "Theodore taught me," Emma said, "through his house and his collection and his letter. He taught me that the world will always try to make you feel small for being different. But different is how you protect the beautiful things. Different is how you find magic." They sat until the stars came out, until the fireflies faded, until the owl finished its hunting call. Around them, the Christmas Hobbit house glowed like a promise kept, like a dream made solid, like proof that one person's vision could change the world if someone else was brave enough to see it. Inside the tunnel beneath their feet, treasures worth $300 million rested in climate-controlled chambers, protected and preserved, waiting for tomorrow's visitors to gasp and wonder and remember that beauty matters. But the real treasure, the one that couldn't be insured or appraised or catalogued, was the lesson Theodore had left behind. That judgment is easy, but understanding requires courage. That mockery is simple, but celebration demands generosity. That conformity is safe, but magic lives in the margins where weird people dare to be themselves. Pine Ridge had learned that lesson. Emma had learned it. And through the museum, through the stories, through the annual celebrations and daily tours, thousands more were learning it too. All because a little girl was brave enough to pull on a bookshelf that everyone else assumed was just a bookshelf. All because a grandmother was desperate enough to take a chance on a house everyone else thought was a joke. All because a lonely man spent his life proving that the things the world dismisses are often the things most worth keeping. 5 years after finding the tunnel, Emma stood in front of the Christmas Hobbit house with a college acceptance letter in her hand. Yale, full scholarship, art history program. She was 15 now, having skipped 2 grades, brilliant and kind and unafraid of being exactly who she was. Diane stood beside her, grayer now but stronger, the worry lines around her eyes replaced by laugh lines earned through joy. "You don't have to go," Diane said. "The museum needs you here." Emma shook her head. "The museum needs me to learn everything I can and bring it back. Theodore traveled the world to collect beauty. I need to travel the world to understand it. Then I'll come home and share what I learned." "When did you get so wise?" Diane asked, though she was smiling. "December 1st, 3 years ago," Emma replied. "The night I stopped being afraid of the dark and started looking for treasure." They stood together, looking at the house that had changed everything. The glowing mushrooms that had once embarrassed Emma now filled her with pride. The candy cane shutters that kids had mocked were now photographed and posted and celebrated. The sleigh on the roof that seemed ridiculous had become a symbol of hope to anyone who'd ever felt too different to belong. The Christmas Hobbit house wasn't weird anymore. It was wonderful. It was famous. It was exactly what it had always been, but now the world was finally ready to see it. "Will you keep the lights on while I'm gone?" Emma asked. "Every single night," Diane promised, "so you can always find your way home." Emma hugged her grandmother, this woman who'd saved her and been saved by her, who'd taken the biggest risk of her life and won everything that mattered. "Thank you," Emma whispered. "For what?" "For being brave enough to buy a weird house, for being strong enough to protect Theodore's legacy, for teaching me that home isn't a place, it's us." Diane held her tighter. Always us, sweet girl. Always. That evening, Emma walked through the museum one last time before leaving for college. She touched the stone walls Theodore had carved. She stood in chambers holding treasures that had witnessed centuries of human history. She read his letter again, the one she'd memorized but still carried everywhere. And she understood, finally, what he'd really been saying. It wasn't just about art or collecting or protecting beauty. It was about faith. Faith that someone would eventually understand. Faith that kindness would be rewarded. Faith that magic was real if you were brave enough to believe in it. Theodore had believed. He'd spent his entire life believing even when no one else did. And his faith had been justified. Not just through the collection being saved, but through the lives that were changed, the community that was transformed, the countless people who learned to celebrate difference instead of mock it. Emma walked to the bronze statue of Theodore and sat beside him on the bench. She pulled out a small notebook and wrote, "Dear Theodore, I'm leaving for college tomorrow, but I wanted you to know that your collection is safe, more than safe. It's loved, it's celebrated, it's changing lives every single day. You spent your life alone, but you're not alone anymore. Thousands of people know your story now. They understand what you were doing. They're grateful you were brave enough to be different. I'm grateful. Thank you for hiding treasure in the most unlikely place. Thank you for trusting that someone would find it. Thank you for teaching me that magic is real. I promise I'll keep believing, forever. With love and gratitude, Emma." She tucked the note under the bronze hand, knowing Diane would find it and add it to the collection of letters visitors left at the statue, a growing archive of gratitude and wonder. Then she stood, took one last look at the glowing lights and ridiculous decorations and beautiful strangeness of the Christmas Hobbit house, and walked toward her future, carrying Theodore's lesson in her heart. Magic was real. She'd found proof of it beneath a house everyone thought was a joke. She'd lived it for 5 extraordinary years. And now she'd spend her life helping others find it too, because the world needed people who believed in beauty, in wonder, in the glorious possibility that different wasn't wrong. Different was where all the magic lived. You just had to be brave enough to look. Anyone can find magic if they're willing to look past what everyone else sees and believe that beauty hides in the most unlikely places. As the seasons turned and years passed, the Christmas Hobbit house continued to glow every evening, a lighthouse for lost souls, a reminder that judgment fades, but kindness endures, and proof that sometimes the smallest girl with the biggest heart can change the world by simply refusing to accept that weird means worthless. The museum thrived, the town prospered, and Theodore's legacy became immortal, not because he collected priceless art, but because he taught us all that the most valuable thing we can do is protect beauty when the world tries to destroy it, celebrate difference when society demands conformity, and believe in magic when everyone else insists it's impossible. Because for Emma, for Diane, for Pine Ridge, and for everyone who ever felt too different to belong, the Christmas Hobbit house proved that home isn't where you fit in. It's where you're finally free to stand out. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories waiting for you. Click to keep discovering magic with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the most extraordinary treasures are hidden in the places everyone else overlooks.